All right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and this is episode 2 of my ongoing series on biblical creation. Evolutionists simply can't refute the best evidence for biblical creation and the biblical model of ancestry, which we are going to discuss and present on comprehensively throughout this series. And I have a lot to go through in episode 2. Therefore, I am going to get started. We are going to pull up our slides and continue right where we left off. Now, episode 1, we touched on, it was largely an introductory episode to this series on biblical creation. I went over several scientific lines of evidence for a young Earth. I discussed comets. I discussed the decaying magnetic field. I briefly got into C14 found in dinosaur bones, coal, oil, and diamonds. We're going to get into that in detail in this episode. There is a critic, an evolutionist who goes by the Kentucky Atheist. So that means he, like atheists, believes that time, matter, and space came from nothing, but then they will say, well, nothing's not really nothing, and look to quantum fluctuations, and they have their stories. They hope, dream, and imagine that everything came from nothing, that non-living chemicals billions of years ago evolved into the first self-replicating cell. And then from there you get multi-celled evolution, and you get fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, these large-scale changes. Atheists believe in a lot of wild ideas. And so this gentleman responded to a video I put out recently on irrefutable evidence for young Earth creation, and he proved that C14, which is what my video comprised, really is irrefutable evidence for young Earth creation. So we're going to see what he has to say, and we are going to refute it and show you that these guys got nothing. These guys, all they can do is dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge. And so again, we discussed comets, the fact that comets crumble too quickly. We know that comets cannot last very long. They're made up of ice, they're made up of dirt, and they orbit the sun in an elliptical path. And as these comets get close to the sun, their icy material gets blasted out into space. They crumble. And so the question is, if our solar system really were 5 billion years old, the conventional literature will say something between 4.6 and 5 billion years old. And comets simply can't last longer than 10,000 years because they're getting smaller and smaller over time as their material, the icy material, is being blasted off into space. Well, we can actually calculate the rate as to which these comets are being depleted, and that data powerfully indicates that comets cannot last millions of years. And so again, if the solar system really is 5 billion years old, why do we still have comets? And the rescue devices like the Oort cloud, which is non-existent. You can even research. We did a video recently, 3.5 hours of incredible evidence for young Earth creation. We looked up whether or not Oort clouds, if there's any evidence for this Oort cloud, and they admit that no, it's largely speculative. And what I like to say, it's imagination. It is a rescue device. We discussed the decaying magnetic field and the fact that it is decaying rapidly, and we can measure the decay of Earth's magnetic field. And so if you were to run Earth's magnetic field back even 60,000 years, it would have been stronger than a neutron star, which is more than enough to rip the atoms of your body apart. The rescue devices don't work. For example, reversals, magnetic reversals. What is going to get the magnetic field to reverse? What kind of mechanism? Where's their science for that? And if there were magnetic reversals, rapid magnetic reversals, this was expected and predicted by creationists. For example, Dr. Russell Humphreys predicted rapid magnetic reversals during the flood, and that's it. And so this limits the age of the Earth. As a matter of fact, the outer planets, Dr. Russell Humphreys, PhD creationist, he predicted that if our solar system is young and not really 5 billion years old, but the fact that magnetic fields decay so quickly, the outer planets like Uranus, for example, he predicted that they would still have a magnetic field. When we receive that data years later, it turns out that these planets have a magnetic field, and the calculations worked out pretty close to what Dr. Russell Humphreys predicted. And so there's just line of evidence after line of evidence for young Earth creation, for biblical creation. And of course, the best evidence for a young Earth, for biblical creation, is the Bible itself, because this is the actual birth certificate of the universe. We have the birth certificate of the universe. Genesis claims to be the history book of the universe. That's why we can look to empirical scientific data and we see that it confirms biblical creation. Episode 1, I discussed mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Noah. I went into genetic diversity and other lines of genetic evidence that suggest biblical creation is true. And this is exactly what the Bible demanded: one woman, one man that we've all descended from. And that's exactly what the scientific data has powerfully suggested. And so the Bible was written by eyewitnesses, inspired by God. Holy men spake as they are moved by the Holy Ghost. Okay, so we have the birth certificate of the universe. You can count up the genealogies, the dates, and you get roughly 6,200 years. And if you believe in an old Earth, well, that requires several assumptions. These assumptions include naturalism, okay, which is the idea that nature is all that there is, and also uniformitarianism, that rates and conditions are the same today as they've always been. And so that's just a brief recap. I do want to go over now where we left off, which is the agnostic evidence for either creation or evolution. If there were two universes, universe 1, universe 2, in universe 1, creation was true, and universe 2, evolution is true. Let's just say hypothetically. Okay. Well, there would be many observations or pieces of evidence that both models could explain. In the universe that creation's true, evolution could also explain certain lines of evidence. Okay. In the universe that evolution's true, the same thing goes. Creation can explain many lines of evidence. This is what's referred to as non-discriminatory pieces of evidence. So, for example, if I were to say, well, creation is true because the sky is blue, you'd say, well, no. Evolution can also explain why the sky is blue. It's agnostic. If I were to say creation is true because the earth is round, you would say no. Evolution can also explain the shape of the earth. Evolution and creation can explain many observations. They have explanations, reasonable explanations for many lines of evidence. Okay. And so that's why the most important approach when it comes to answering this question of ancestry is to present what's called discriminatory evidence, since there's a lot of overlap in the creation versus evolution debate. Therefore, we want to focus on pieces of evidence that are not agnostic to the debate, differentiating lines of evidence. And we have many lines of evidence for that, which we are going to touch on in this series. So here are agnostic pieces of evidence: classification, homology, nested hierarchies, and transitional fossils. Let's get into this. Classification systematics, it's arbitrary, it's largely subjective. Okay, taxonomy, you probably all remember Linnaeus taxonomy: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So we can organize animals into specific categories based on traits and characteristics. Okay, you can even get what's called nested hierarchical patterns. The fact that humans and chimpanzees, when you examine their traits, their characteristics, similarities and dissimilarities, they are going to group together more closely than, let's say, if you were to bring in a dog, a fish, or a bacteria. So classification systematics, again, it's man-made. We're classifying things in the same way that we could go to a car lot, pick a car dealership, go there. You're going to find that the vehicles are classified in specific sections, in specific groups. SUVs over here, vans over here, sedans over here, okay? Or even in specific manufacturers. We do the same thing with our books. For example, my book collection upstairs, I've got books organized in different categories: theology, science-related books, okay, books dealing with political issues. And even within those larger groups, you can have subgroups. Let's say in the category of God or theology, you can also have a subsection called soteriology, the study of salvation. Or you could have the nature of God, the study of the Trinity. Okay, you have your communication books or sales books in different sections, health books. Okay, that's just something we do. You can also do the same thing with tools. You go into your shed, your work shed, and you got your tools categorized in certain groups. Okay, and so it doesn't prove either creation or evolution, because classifying things does not prove any kind of relationship. Similarity does not equate relationship. We could make a category. If you draw a circle big enough, then you can fit nearly everything into it. Let's say we were to make a category called things that breathe. Okay, well, now you got every single form of life: lions, babies, horses, gorillas, bats. So if you draw a smaller circle, then you're not going to be able to fit as much in. But again, that doesn't necessitate relationship. It just shows that we may have a little too much time on our hands. We can categorize certain things. You can categorize just about anything. Okay. When it comes to creatures, the dogs don't really care that we classified them as a canid, or your cats don't really care that we classified them as a felid. Okay. It's something we like to do. And again, it doesn't declare relationship. It's helpful. Okay. But it doesn't prove creation or evolution. Things affected by gravity. Well, now you can get bowling balls in there. You can get chairs, shoes, motorized transportation. Okay. You're not going to be able to have a bicycle in there or skateboard, but you can have planes, motorboats, trucks, vans, motorcycles. Right here, man-made classification systems. We do the same thing with automobiles. So you can get a PhD in automobile classification systematics, and you can classify or arrange automobiles based on the purpose of the vehicle, the load capacity, the type of fuel, the number of wheels that the vehicle has. Okay, 2 wheels, 4 wheels, something with more than that, like a bus, suspension system, engine location, so on and so forth. So again, classification systematics, it is largely agnostic. It's not really going to help us to advance in a real meaningful way in the creation versus evolution debate. Okay. The next one is homology, shared structures in the biological world. This could also be applied to genetics. So you have homologous patterns in morphology and anatomy, but also in genetics. There's interesting mosaics. That's another one, like Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik being your famous fishapod, they like to call it. And so we are going to examine those. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, homologous structures, right? Comparative anatomy. You've got similarities there in arm structure with the human, the cat, the whale, the bat. Okay, so when it comes to the creationist model, similarities are there due to homology. The biblical model that I hold to starts from the understanding that the Bible says we are created in the image of God. And if we're created in the image of God, there must be something about us that reflects the divine. Therefore, maybe we can get a sense for how God designed the biological world based on the way we design things. Well, it just so turns out that we, due to functional purposes, we design in homologous patterns. You can find thousands of similarities between modes of transportation. Take a sedan, take a sedan like a Chevy Cruze, and take a minivan like a Dodge Caravan, okay, made by Chrysler. Well, you're going to find many similarities and dissimilarities. They're going to have 4 tires in common. The vehicles are going to be a certain height from the ground. They're going to have windshields. Okay, you can get vehicles from different continents, North America, Asia, and Europe. And they're all going to have similarities. That doesn't mean that they share a common ancestor in the Arctic, a common Arctic ancestor. So homology is due to design. The evolutionists would argue that homology is due to descent with modification, common ancestry, that these similar structures were inherited from past common ancestors. What's interesting, though, is even in the genomes of living organisms, if you were to examine similar sequences between human DNA and chimpanzee DNA, you would find differences in the way those genes are regulated or in the way those genes are expressed. You'll find epigenetic differences. And so even in similar sequences, you still find differences. And so although it's largely agnostic, when you dig a little deeper, I like to say it's the differences that make all the difference. Then you see that the design model has far better explanations. Okay, gene regulation, gene expression, epigenetics, these are mechanisms or functions that point to a designer. Gene regulation is basically that process that is used to control the timing, the location, and amount in which genes are expressed. And gene expression has to do with the way DNA directs the synthesis of proteins, right? DNA to RNA to protein. But you got a lot of functional RNAs. And so you have DNA to RNA, but not necessarily to a protein. DNA transcribed into RNA, translated into protein. No, translated into RNA, and then you have RNA products. And so we're going to get into, throughout this series, the differentiating evidence that focuses on DNA function, the fact that the majority of the genome is functional, at least 80%. The evolutionists say, well, that activity is mostly spurious or noise. But no, I've debunked that, and I am going to debunk that assertion or claim in this ongoing series. And you're going to see that DNA function can help us to differentiate between the models. Homology. Selected similarities between organisms are said to be evidence of common ancestry. These similarities can be visible features or at the protein/DNA level, but the argument is the same. This is an example of the fallacy of affirming the consequent, right? It'd be like going outside and seeing that the grass is wet. Oh, it must have rained. Must have rained. The grass is wet. But no, the grass could be wet for a number of reasons. Maybe somebody had the sprinkler on. Okay. And so that is affirming the consequent. Just because there are similarities in anatomy and genetics does not mean that evolution's true, or evolution is the only model that can explain that observation. And it's funny, there's something called convergent evolution, which the evolutionists, they'll say, well, these similar structures can't be due to ancestry because, or at least recent ancestry, because these two organisms share too distant of a common ancestor. Okay. So therefore, they invoke what's called convergent evolution, the independent evolution of these traits or these systems. That's why they have to say the eye, the incredibly complex and sophisticated eye system, or the echolocation system of certain creatures, evolved independently, in some cases, dozens of times. And what that is, anytime they invoke convergent evolution, they are admitting to the lack of uniqueness in the universal phylogenetic tree of life. These are inconsistencies. The pervasive pattern of homoplasy, which is the term evolutionists use for similarities that cannot be explained by any conceivable pattern of common ancestry, undermines the logic of the argument. Remember, it's the differences that make all the difference. And creationists, we can explain the similarities. Similarity due to common design. Human engineers build in design patterns, in homologous patterns, and so did God. We can get a sense for how God created based on the way we design things. And it just so turns out that we design in homologous patterns. Common design explains all similarities, both homologies and homoplasies. So, creationists, we can explain the similarities and we can also explain the differences and the massive differences. Like, for example, your human and chimpanzee Y chromosomes. Y chromosome is uniparentally inherited DNA. It's nuclear DNA, but it's non-recombining. Okay. And so it's only passed down on the father's side. It's less messy for that reason. No recombination, no gene shuffling per generation. And when you compare the human and chimpanzee Y chromosomes, our Y chromosomes are only about 25 to 30% the same. Those are massive differences. And that's when you consider overall gene content, size differences, and architecture. Every single male Y chromosome, human male Y chromosome, 99.999% the same. You could take every single male Y chromosome on the planet, build a family tree, and they go back to a single Y chromosomal ancestor just 4,500 years ago. But then you bring in the chimpanzee, and supposedly they're our closest cousin on the tree of life. And so you'd expect that Y chromosome to be somewhat similar, and yet it's completely different. It's nothing alike. Somewhere between 25 and 30% the same. But evolutionists cannot explain the pervasive homoplasies. Evolutionists cannot explain the massive differences. Remember, gene expression, gene regulation. Gene expression, that process by which a DNA is, a gene is turned on, okay, to create a functional protein or RNA. Well, even in similar sequences, again, there are differences in the way those genes are regulated or the way those genes are expressed. The differences abound, and it's the differences that help to provide discriminatory evidence, and that discriminatory evidence is on the side of the creation. Notice this: the camera eye, evolutionists say, must have evolved independently 6 times. 6 times, let alone one time. They have to invoke 6 times for the evolution of the eye. Labeling such things as due to convergent evolution is pure circular reasoning and lacks any explanatory power. This is similar to orphan genes. So we have what's called orphan genes. These are these taxonomically restricted and essential genes. Okay. They're orphan because there's no evidence for their ancestry, their evolutionary ancestry. They just pop up, they're unique, they're functional. You find them in some creatures and then different ones in another creature. For example, humans will have their own unique orphan genes. Chimpanzees would have their own unique orphan genes. Gorillas would have their own unique orphan genes. This is exactly what we would expect if common design were true, if the account of origins in Genesis were true, because these are uniquely designed DNA elements. It'd be like having 3 books. One book has certain words with a certain meaning that book 2 doesn't have. Book 2 has its own unique set of words, and then same with book 3. So they're unique in their own way. Okay? That's what we find in the genomes of biological organisms with orphan genes. Circular reasoning is how they explain this. So rather than tapping out, what they do is they invoke certain mechanisms. One of them is de novo gene synthesis, that non-coding regions of the genome can become functional and result in an orphan gene. But again, this is circular reasoning. They haven't observed this. They have no real solid empirical evidence for this. What they see are orphan genes. So they say, why are these there? They're not going to conclude design or special creation, that they were front-loaded there for functional reasons. No. So they invoke de novo gene synthesis. But you ask them, well, why de novo gene synthesis? Why is this a thing? Well, because orphan genes exist. See, it's this circle. Orphan genes exist because of de novo gene synthesis. Why is de novo gene synthesis a mechanism to create functional genes? Well, because orphan genes exist. So it's the circular reasoning that they're so good at. Why did God create similarities? Here are 4 rather obvious reasons why God would have created similarities. We went over a couple of these. One pattern points to one creator. So if you did not have homologous patterns, it could look like polytheism was true. We have all these different gods creating their own unique creatures with their own unique building blocks. So one creation utilizes DNA, RNA, and proteins. And then another creation uses something totally different, just alien. Well, then you might be forced to conclude that polytheism is true. But we know the Bible teaches monotheism, one God. 2, design economy. Why reinvent the wheel? We need to be similar. Food. Ecological reasons, right? Recycling of nutrients. Historically, creation with similarities, reusing good design features, has been a mark of created prowess. The idea that new/different is better is a very modern idea. The homoplasies refute naturalistic attempts to explain the similarities without God. So here's the thing, though. The question is, did evolutionists actually predict the level of homologous signatures that we find in the biological world? And from my study, the answer is no. Because if evolution is true, if deep time evolution is true, and creatures have been evolving for millions and millions of years, and the so-called genetic mechanisms for evolutionary change and forward evolution is mutations, natural selection, you would look to genetic drift, gene flow, recombination, gene conversion, so on and so forth. Well, guess what? These mutations would be accumulating. They say that the mutations are predominantly neutral, which means they have no effect on selection. They're not really harmful in any way. And so they build up over time, and they act as a hidden reservoir for genetic change in the future. Well, what that would do is actually scramble genomes. They're building up in organisms over time. And so today we should find genomes that are more scrambled, less of a homologous signature. Okay. But yet we find a strong signal, homology signal. Well, that shouldn't be the case if we've been evolving for millions and millions of years. It's common design proponents that actually expect those signatures to be there if we were designed by God, by a designer. And that same thing is true for nested hierarchical patterns. Another one is these mosaics, these interesting mosaics like Tiktaalik. Well, it's interesting. Even if you examine each so-called mosaic, firstly, in the fossil record, what you find is abrupt appearance. You find stasis. You find mixed environments. We've done many talks and conferences here with creationist geologists like John Mackay, the creation guy, Joseph Hubbard, where they've demonstrated mixed environments is largely what you find. You mostly find marine organisms in the fossil record. The fossil record is extremely incomplete. Again, you see stasis. You find a lot of living fossils. I did a whole 3-part comprehensive series with Dr. Carl Werner on living fossils. Please do check that out. And again, abrupt appearance. Okay, where these very sophisticated systems just pop up out of nowhere with no real evidence of large-scale evolutionary changes leading up to these highly complex organisms. But if large-scale evolution were true, if common descent was true, universal common ancestry, this idea that all life, including all plants and animals, are related through common ancestry, there should be no question. We should find tens of thousands of transitional forms between all your major groups: fish to amphibian, amphibian to reptile, reptile to mammal, and then eventually mammal to man, man being a mammal. Okay. And everything in between. But we find a few interesting candidates. That's it. That are better understood as being interesting mosaics. But even if you examine them, like Tiktaalik, for example, they thought that this was the perfect transitional form, this fishapod. Okay. But yet, years later, they discover true tetrapod foot tracks predating Tiktaalik by 20 to 40 million years in Poland. Oh, well, there goes Tiktaalik as a transitional form. And then they employ, as usual, a rescue device. Well, it's not that Tiktaalik's in the main lineage. Okay. It's just an example of what the transitional form could have looked like, or just an example of a transitional form. Okay, so you can really get into the details and show them why each so-called transitional form fails. But you could also point out the fact that finding a few mosaics is agnostic to the debate. Again, this goes back to the creation model. If we're made in the image of God, there should be something that in us reflects the divine, something about us that reflects the divine. So we should be able to get a sense for how God created based on the way we design. And it just so turns out that we, to design hard to classify vehicles, we design quote unquote transitional forms. Okay. So this is characteristic of design. For example, on the screen here, you see the Jeep Gladiator. You have these crossover SUVs, the perfect so-called transitional form. Is it an SUV? Is it a van? No, it's something in between. But it fits a need. It meets a need. You'll find somebody who doesn't really want a van. They don't really want an SUV. What they want is a crossover, something right in between that again meets their need. Okay. Jeep Gladiator here. What is it? A truck? Is it a Jeep? It's a mix, but it's there for functional reasons. Okay. Here again, your crossover SUV resists classification. It's all for good design. Look at this 1961 Amphicar. So you got a mix of a land vehicle like a sedan and then an amphibious vehicle. 1970 Bond Bug. So you can find all interesting cars that blend the features of different types of modes of transportation. The military, they invented what's called the military amphibious assault vehicle. You have tanks that are great on land. You have warships that are great in the sea, for war in the sea. But what about that transitional environment between sea and land? Well, that's where the military amphibious assault vehicle comes into play. It's built and designed for that transitional environment between sea and land. The tank wouldn't be any good in the water. The warship's not very good on the land, of course. But your military amphibious assault vehicle, blending both features, is perfectly suited for that transitional environment. Okay, so that military amphibious assault vehicle wouldn't be the best just on land or just in the sea, but it is perfect for that transitional environment. So where you find transitional environments or mosaic environments, you might find an interesting mosaic creature that's designed or adapted to that environment. Then what proponents of evolution want to do is line things up. So they're going to take that military amphibious assault vehicle, stick it right in between a ship and a tank, and say one evolved from the other. That's exactly what they do in the fossil record. Because what you see in the fossil record is incredible diversity. Today, what we see is just a small snapshot of the overall diversity that has existed on the planet. So when they prop up, most of the times, these so-called transitional forms, it's just a reflection of pre and post-flood diversity. Okay. Again, you have a unicycle, tricycle, and let's say you have a unicycle, a bicycle, and a four-wheeler. Oh, look, these vehicles, one has one wheel, one has two, the other one has four. So I could predict, well, there's got to be one that has three out there. Lo and behold, there is. Find it in a junkyard somewhere and say, this is the transitional form. Line it up, and here's evolution. No, lining things up does not prove anything. Okay. The next is nested hierarchies, but I'm going to save that for episode 3, as I do want to now spend the next half on carbon-14. So let's move right into the C14 issue. Right here, carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, but again, also in diamonds, in coal, basically anything with carbon in it. And so you'll see that the critics' rescue devices fail miserably. The critics have failed tremendously to debunk this incredible line of evidence for a young Earth. And so C14 is a variety of carbon. Okay, it's produced in the upper atmosphere when cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms, converting them into C14. C14 then decays back into nitrogen with a half-life of 5,700 years. So it's a very short half-life. That's basically how long it takes for half of the C14 to decay back into nitrogen. We have plants that absorb some of this carbon. We have animals that eat the plants. We as humans also eat the animals. We eat the plants. And when we eat the animals or we eat the plants, then we are taking in that C14. And creatures use C14 to build their bodies. Okay. But what that means is a small fraction of us, of animals, is C14. And as we are alive, we're eating the animals, we're eating the plants. So even though the C14 is decaying, we're constantly replenishing that C14 as the C14 is decaying back into what? Into nitrogen. Okay. But when you die, you are no longer replacing that C14 because you're no longer consuming anything. You're no longer eating animals or plants that are also taking in the C14. And so it basically just decays away, and it decays away rather quickly. It decays away rapidly. And so what we can do because of this process, because of what we know about this process, is we can use carbon dating to help us understand how long ago something may have died. But unfortunately for the evolutionists, when we test samples that guardians of common descent claim are millions to billions of years old, like coal beds, diamonds, dinosaur bones, what we find is high levels of C14. We find detectable levels of C14 where they shouldn't be. So we're getting thousands of years for samples that evolutionists claim are millions to billions of years. Millions to billions of years old. So notice this, even if every atom in the whole Earth were carbon-14, they would decay so quickly that no carbon-14, excuse me, would be left on Earth only after 1 million years. And that's being generous. Okay. So we should not find any C14 in anything that is 1 million years. a million years old. Notice this, carbon-14. A sea creature called an ammonite was discovered near Redding, California, accompanied by fossilized wood. Both fossils are claimed by strata dating to be 112 to 120 million years old. So obviously, a lot older than a million years old. And yet, what did they find? Radiocarbon. And they yielded radiocarbon ages of only thousands of years, consistent with biblical creation. And many of these samples, like diamonds, for example, they're buried so deep in the rock strata that they're completely shielded from cosmic rays in the atmosphere. Because remember, C14 is produced in the upper atmosphere due to cosmic ray bombardment. Where these samples are, there's no source for new C14. But the fact that we find C14 in dinosaur remains, in coal, in diamonds, and again, essentially anything that has carbon in it, it means the earth is nowhere. This is discriminatory evidence. Only the creation model can account for this. The earth cannot be even a million years old, let alone, it can't even be 100,000 years old in light of what we know about C14. Okay. Now there's other radioactive decay processes like potassium to argon, uranium to lead that are extremely slow in the way that they decay. So they want to use those dating methods for things that they think are millions to billions of years old. But again, when we check for carbon, when we do carbon dating, there shouldn't be any C14. And yet it's exactly what we find. Again, look at this. Carbon-14 in coal suggests ages of thousands of years and clearly contradict ages of millions of years. Carbon-14 in oil suggests thousands, not millions of years. Carbon-14 in fossil wood also indicates ages of thousands, not millions of years. Carbon-14 in diamonds suggests ages of thousands, not billions of years. Diamonds are found deep within the earth. They're the hardest substance on the planet. They are resistant to contamination. Therefore, the C14 found in diamonds should be intrinsic. Note that attempts to explain away carbon-14 in diamonds, coal, etc., such as by neutrons from uranium decay converting nitrogen to C14, do not work. They've been addressed. This idea that, well, nearby nuclear material can recharge the C14 in these samples. No. The RATE team looked at it, a group of highly knowledgeable and well-credentialed scientists. You would need thousands. You would need 13,000 times more nuclear material to recharge the C14. Unrealistic amounts. Notice this. Geophysicist Dr. John Baumgartner, part of the RATE research group, investigated C14 in a number of diamonds. There should be no C14 at all if they were really over 1 billion years old. Yet the Radiocarbon lab reported that there was over 10 times the detection limit. So it's not just trace amounts. There's a lot. Thus, they had a radiocarbon age far less than 1 million years. Dr. Baumgartner repeated this with 6 more alluvial diamonds, and these had even more radiocarbon. The presence of radiocarbon in these diamonds where there should be none is thus sparkling evidence for a young world, as the Bible records. The first cry is all contamination. Excuse me for my cough. So these samples are subjected to harsh treatments, multiple washes in acid to ensure there's no instrument contamination. They have another one that this critic that I'm going to play his video soon, they'll say, well, environmental contamination. That doesn't work either. It's all a joke. I'll show you in a second. Yet for 30 years, AMS radiocarbon laboratories have subjected all samples before they carbon-14 date them to repeated brutal treatments with strong acids and bleaches to rid them all of contamination. And when the instruments are tested with blank samples, they yield 0 radiocarbon. So there can't be any contamination or instrument problems. The second cry, which I just briefly addressed, New radiocarbon was formed directly in the fossils when nearby decaying uranium bombarded traces of nitrogen in the buried fossils. This is their second rescue device. Carbon-14 does form from such transformation of nitrogen, but actual calculation, so when the math is done, it demonstrates conclusively that this process does not produce the levels of radiocarbon that world-class laboratories have found in fossils, coal, and diamonds. It's a rescue device. It doesn't work. The critics simply don't want to tap out. Okay. It would be, I'll use an analogy to make it understandable. Say you have a gallon of milk, a milk carton. Take a little pin and poke just a tiny little hole in it. Well, what you're going to have is very slow leakage. Well, just a drop here and there is going to come out of the milk, right? That's akin or analogous to your slowly decaying dating methods, radioisotopes like potassium to argon, uranium to lead. They decay very slowly. Okay. Much longer or half-lives as compared to carbon-14, 5,700 years, very short. So take another carton of milk and poke a big hole in it, cut a big, huge hole into it. Well, now the milk's going to be leaking out quickly. And before you know it, there's not going to be any milk left over. And if you do find that there's milk in that carton with the big hole in it, then you're going to conclude that, well, that hole must have been cut in relatively recently in time because all the milk hasn't leaked out yet. But the other carton that just has a pinhole in it, well, it's not surprising that that carton of milk could last a long time before it completely leaks out. So you're going to try and replenish the milk carton that's just gushing out milk with the other milk carton that is just having a drop here and there. It's never going to happen. You would need 20 to 30 of those milk cartons, all with a small little pinhole, in order to replenish the one that is rapidly leaking out milk. See why it doesn't work? It's a rescue mechanism. The numbers are unrealistic. You would need 13,000 times more nuclear material to recharge what we find in things like diamonds. These guys, these critics, they're lazy. They don't actually go read the papers. They don't go look at the radiocarbon literature in these journals. Notice this. This isn't creationist journals right here. AMS age determinations from the secular radiocarbon literature for samples that, given their position in the geological record, ought to be entirely, notice this, C14 free. Here's all your references. Look at it yourself. Marble, shell, foraminifera, whalebone, wood, going back 1987, 1984. That's kind of kept secret. They don't really talk about it, but it's there. Note, C14 value for 40,900 years corresponds to, pay attention to this, 1,270 times the AMS detection limit. This is not just trace amounts, guys. This is not just background detection. No, this is over 1,000 times the AMS detection limit. Notice this, when the rate team analyzed. So your rate scientists, people like Dr. John Baumgardner, Dr. Andrew Snelling, Dr. Russell Humphreys, Steve Austin, they knew about this data, okay, these dates, the fact that you're finding C14 in just about everything in the geological rock strata. Because you're finding C14 in all these different fossils in your entire rock strata, the fossils are in the rock strata. That says the fossils can't be old, the rock strata can't be old. Both, they go hand in hand. So the rate team said, okay, let's look into this. Let's see how true, how accurate this is. And they did the same tests and they've got the same results. C14 in all kinds of samples. Notice this on the coal. Results of rate C14 analysis of 10 coal samples. These analyses were performed using the laboratory's high precision procedures that involved 4 separate runs for each sample. and you can find multiple. Right here is the detection limit. All 10 coal samples, the levels of C14 that are found consistent with the Genesis flood just 4,500 years ago. Rate C14 measurements of 6 African diamonds. Results are between 40 times and 310 times the AMS detection limit. Again, it's not just trace amounts. So you critics in the chat that dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge, you're not actually addressing this evidence for young earth, for biblical creation in any meaningful and sophisticated manner. You're avoiding it altogether. You're making assertions that you can't back up. Here's the data. Okay. C14 has been detected in items, in samples that should be entirely C14 free. It's all throughout the radiocarbon literature. And this is secular radiocarbon literature. 1,270 times the AMS detection limit. This needs to be engaged, guys. Now, somebody did attempt to engage it and failed miserably. So I'm going to stop the screen share, get it back up, and get the audio going. And we're going to listen to a bit of his video here. And so I did click audio. So let's listen to what Kentucky Atheist has to say. Can he explain to us in an empirical manner, in a sophisticated manner, why we find C14 all throughout the rock strata in samples that should have no C14? And yet we find high levels of C14 in just about everything with carbon. Let's see what he's got for us. Carbon-14. Okay. So carbon-14 created in the upper atmosphere through cosmic ray bombardment, and C14 decays into nitrogen-14. We as humans, we eat plants, we eat animals. Plants and animals are taking in C14. So we're constantly having our C14 decay back into nitrogen-14, but we are consuming plants and animals that are also taking in C14 to build their bodies, okay? So it's this process that's taking place.
Skunk really got her.
Yep.
You know your Chromebook Plus can give that a little zhuzh.
Promise me.
Donny starts talking about carbon-14 and radiocarbon dating, and right off the bat, I found it suspicious that Donny says carbon-14 created in the upper atmosphere by cosmic rays, and only mentions that mechanism, because carbon-14 is created in a number of ways.
That's not suspicious. That's basic science, a basic understanding how C14 is produced. It's produced in the upper atmosphere when cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms. As a result, this converts them into C14, and that's where your C14 decays back into nitrogen. We talked about how the half-life is 5,700 years, but he's going to have to try desperately to have C14 in the environment, deep in the rock strata, where these samples are shielded from the cosmic ray bombardment, to explain why we have high levels of C14 in these samples. I challenge Kentucky Atheist right now to show me where is predicted prior to finding all this radiocarbon in these samples, like diamonds, coal, fossils, soft tissue. Show me where they predicted before finding it. Oh, you know what? We expect to find detectable levels of radiocarbon, high levels of radiocarbon, even though it shouldn't be there, but it is there for environmental reasons or whatever factor he wants to look to. Now, here's the thing about Kentucky Atheist. He is not actually engaging counterpoints. He put out a video against my video on the Y chromosome. I've been debating. I've had 100 formal debates and probably about 300 informal open mic type discussions. Okay. So this ain't my first rodeo. And so I think I'm just going to have to debate or have a discussion with Kentucky Atheist, because he's not addressing counterpoints. He's not addressing rebuttals. I responded to his video that he did against me on Y chromosome, the Y chromosome. I did over a 2-hour impromptu debate with Erica on that issue. And we went over the latest paper that suggests that the human and chimpanzee Y chromosomes are less than 30% the same. So it's even worse now for the evolutionists. I've discussed why sperm competition doesn't work. I've explained why, according to the biblical model of ancestry, bonobos and chimpanzees can be related, even though there are some differences in their Y chromosomes. But when you bring in the human Y chromosomes, the differences are too massive, and you would need the addition of genes and the massive loss of genes. Whereas you don't really need the addition of genes. You don't really need anything truly novel in the chimpanzee or bonobo lineages when it comes to the Y chromosomes. There's specific kind of heterochromatin, this densely packed piece of DNA that largely comprises repetitive sequences like satellite DNA in your human Y chromosome, whereas you don't find it in your chimpanzee or your bonobo Y chromosomes. Anyways, these are issues that Kentucky Atheist didn't address. He did not engage my rebuttal. He won't engage this one. And so we just have to have a discussion where I can hold his feet to the fire on these issues that he simply isn't refuting.
Ways, and is a big part of the background radiation observed on our planet. Just to break down what carbon-14 is and how it's used, when nitrogen is exposed to cosmic rays or other sources of radiation, it is converted into carbon-14 and has a known half-life at which it decays into nitrogen-14. We can measure the ratio of those elements in previously living things to figure out a date range in which it died. Carbon-14 is only valid for dating up to about 60,000 years, but not generally used as a...
And this is why they will expose how biased and their lack of critical thinking skills, because they'll say, well, why are you even testing these samples? You know, those samples are millions to billions of years old. So they're assuming evolution to prove evolution because they have a worldview with basic presuppositions. They're not going to tap out. They're going to come up with a rescue device. And it's hilarious when they say things like that. It makes us more confident as young earth creationists. Yeah, that's the prediction. If the earth really is billions of years old and carbon-14 has such a short half-life, let's test that. Let's go pick up samples that you claim are millions to billions of years old. Again, if every single atom in the universe, on the earth, in the earth, was made of C14, it would all decay away within 1 million years. Very simple prediction, very simple test. Is the earth really billions of years old? Let's go see. Oh, diamonds don't have any C14. Oh, coal doesn't have any C14. Okay, that makes sense if the earth is old. Shouldn't be there. Would have all decayed away. Oh, wait, we find C14 in basically everything in the geological rock layers. Okay, prediction for creationists, point for creationists. But then these guys want to assert, well, you can't be dating those. You can't be looking for C14 in those things because we know those are millions of years old. No, that's an assumption. That is you assuming that evolution is true, that the earth is billions of years old. It's not actually addressing the data.
Primary dating method on samples older than 25,000 years, because as the amount of carbon-14 diminishes, it makes it more difficult to measure such small amounts of decay. And again, we see a lot of it in the background radiation, which only adds to that difficulty. We only use carbon-14 on once living organisms because we find it in a lot of different things in small amounts. When living organisms consume food, water, and air.
As we saw in the charts earlier that I showed on my slideshow, no, it's not just trace amounts, high amounts, and in just about everything with carbon.
They continually increase and replace the amounts of carbon in their systems, making it significantly higher than that measured in the background. And when those things die, that carbon then begins to decay back into nitrogen.
See, if it was a weak signal, he'd have a point. He'd have a point. But all carbon in fossils, whether in bone, shell, or soft tissue, contains a weak signal? No. Contains a strong C14 signal, powerful C14 signal from when the fossilized organism was still alive. And because the half-life of C14 is so short, which he just acknowledged here, this means that all fossilized organisms were alive only a few thousand years ago, and the rock strata that they're found in are also only a few thousand years old.
Donny also has this slide up about every atom on Earth being carbon-14, saying it would be depleted in 1 million years. And in a vacuum, I don't know, that may hold. I'm not doing the math, but since the Earth is steadily bombarded by cosmic rays, it would continually replenish the amount of carbon-14 as it decays.
Again, these samples are found so deep in the rocks that they're shielded and guarded from cosmic ray bombardment.
And is radiated again. But that's not really the point here. Let's move on.
And dead organisms aren't eating plants, eating animals, and replenishing their C14. When we die, we're no longer replenishing our C14. And so the C14 is just decaying back into nitrogen. And eventually it should decay to the point, this isn't difficult. Eventually it should decay to the point where there is none left. But the fact that we find C14 and plenty of it suggests that these fossils, these samples really aren't millions to billions of years old. The problem is, though, when we die, when a creature dies, they no longer take in C14. So it just decays back into nitrogen. But the half-life on C14 decay is very short. It's about 5,700 years.
This is kind of weird because on one hand, he is acknowledging the half-life of carbon-14 and accepting the data it provides, while arguing about the half-life, which is almost as many years as he believes the Earth is old. He's trying to have it both ways here, claiming that carbon-14 science proves the Earth is not millions of years old, but by accepting that, it still debunks his claim that it's only 6,000 years old. And this is a common ploy with young Earth creationists. They will happily accept a scientific mechanism as long as it works, but then deny it the second that it contradicts.
So he's dodging, he's not getting it. He's assuming evolution to prove evolution. He's completely missing the point. It's going right over his head. Let's assume that you're right. Let's assume that your model is true. Let's assume that the Earth is millions to billions of years old. We understand the process of C14 decay. Okay, so let's go in with that assumption. Let's assume that the Earth is millions to billions of years old, and let's see if the data matches that. Let's see if what we know about C14 and C14 decay and production fits your assumption. Well, guess what? It doesn't, because we find C14 in samples like dinosaur fossils, diamonds, coal, where there shouldn't be the C14. Okay. So since we're only getting thousands of years, which means you can't have your fish to fisherman evolution. You can't have your particles to people evolution. Okay. You can't have your goo to you, goo to the zoo to you evolution, because you require millions and millions and millions of years to evolve a single-celled like ancestor into a whale, into a human. So the next question would be, okay, how reliable are the dates? How reliable is the dating method itself? If we're getting diamonds and coal that are supposed to be, again, millions to billions of years old, we're only getting thousands of years. Is it coming back right at 6,000? No. And we can answer that. But it's certainly not coming in at millions to billions of years old, which limits the age of the Earth. And so time is like the pacifier to the evolutionists. You remove time and they start to whine, they start to complain, they start to invoke rescue devices and rescue mechanisms.
Their narrative. Donny is arguing because carbon-14 gives us dates of thousands of years on diamonds, it proves they are not millions of years old. But if you say, well, it dates things to 50,000.
No, because Mr. Kentucky Atheist, we can't assume that the C14 to C12 ratio has been constant since the creation of the Earth. We have good reason to believe that it hasn't been constant. Okay. And so before the flood year, the ratio is different. The C14 is produced by cosmic rays striking nitrogen atoms, as we've been discussing. And so that would tend to build up over time. Okay. And so at creation, there may not have been any C14 in the atmosphere, but then it would start to build up over time. And therefore the C14 in the atmosphere would what? Increase over time, which is why we would typically get the inflated ages, the thousands of years, instead of right on 6,000 years. Okay. And there are many, we've discussed this with PhD scientists like Dr. Jason Lyle. Let's see him engage those. There's good theoretical and empirical reasons for this. Okay. So creationists can explain the data. You're only getting thousands of years for things that you're supposed to get billions of years for. Actually, you're not even supposed to get any C14. There shouldn't be any C14 in there for us to even be having this debate. So Kentucky Atheist, we're 5 minutes in and you're failing.
Years, he'll argue that it's not a valid dating method.
Here we go. Showtime.
What is this?
Okay, what this means is we should not find any C14 in anything on this earth and in this earth that is supposedly millions to billions of years.
But we do, right? Well, kinda. We don't find it at levels to suggest those things were living less than 6,000 years ago, first of all. And
Again, we find them in things that are supposed to be millions to billions of years old. They shouldn't even be there. We're getting dates of thousands of years for things that you're saying are hundreds of millions of years. I want to see you engage this, Kentucky Atheist, and we can engage it in a discussion. I'm happy to do it here on the channel. Okay. These samples, go through them. They should be entirely C14 free. But note, the C14 value for 40,900 years corresponds to what? 1,270 times the AMS detection limit. This is not looking good for you at all. Okay. There's 8 diamonds here, 6 diamonds. Results are between 40 times and 310 times the AMS detection limit. This needs to be engaged because all we're getting here are assertions, straw man's, misunderstandings.
And Donny knows this, but he leaves that part out. He mentions that it's not trace amounts, but doesn't bother to mention that the amounts we find in fossils is exponentially less than it would be.
They shouldn't even be there. Exponentially less. It's like saying the milk carton that I cut this massive hole through, you know, it's still leaking out milk 6 months after I cut the hole. The milk shouldn't even be there. The C14 shouldn't be there, especially in the amounts that we find the C14 in it. You know, I was really hoping for a challenge, but it's not a challenge at all because all of these have been engaged. Has Kentucky Atheist read the work on this? Notice this, Dr. John Baumgartner. Are the radiocarbon C14 results caused by contamination? This has been engaged. These arguments have all been dismantled. These are highly comprehensive technical articles. And notice this here. AMS measurements on samples conventionally deemed C14 dead. So you can look at all the references there. You got to put in the work. If you think you're going to refute what I'm presenting here, then you need to put in the work. Enough dodging, enough assertions, enough straw man arguments. Have you read this, Kentucky Atheist? No, 99.999% of the critics have not actually read the work. They haven't read the technical papers on this issue. Okay, so have a look at this. Have a look at the fact that these rescue devices have already been demolished. They've been engaged. Contamination doesn't work. Recharging of the C14 from nearby nuclear material doesn't work. You know, and he'll say well, these are creationist scientists. Okay, that's fallacious. You're just hand waving away the work because they're creationists, because they don't believe they're related to banana plants. It's time to engage in a sophisticated manner here, Kentucky Atheist.
Be for an animal that was eating, drinking, and breathing carbon less than 6,000 years ago. And those fossils being close to groundwater, radioactive materials, or even bacterial contamination would contribute to its presence. So explanations, but not getting to the real point of the problem here. Look, I know.
Yeah, you're not getting to the point of the problem. This is the best he has to offer. The rest of his video, he just complains and says, oh, creation scientists don't do real science or make predictions, even though we've gone over many of the predictions already. The magnetic field predictions, the predictions here in terms of radiocarbon. Okay, the amount of C14, Kentucky Atheist, averages out to be the same regardless of the fossil. Where it's found, the depth it's found in, and where in the world it's discovered. Therefore, contamination that you're appealing to, this has already been engaged. Do you think these PhD scientists on the rate team, they haven't already engaged these critiques that have been out 10 plus years ago? You're just repeating arguments from YouTube evolutionists who are repeating their arguments from people who have put out written critiques to the rate team, but the rate team demolished those critiques. But you guys pretend like those haven't been engaged, and therefore you're just going to fail over and over again, as you're proving here. Okay. So, This whole issue of contamination is just weak. Somehow modern carbon snuck into all of the fossils all over the earth in every depth and in every kind of fossil. Again, this has all been debunked. It's all been engaged. This idea that, well, modern carbon has a lot of carbon-14 in it, and if somehow some, let's say, fungus infested a piece of coal and somehow the coal wasn't washed free of the fungus, perhaps we'd get some carbon-14 in it. The idea of organisms getting in and contaminating the material is extremely questionable. Okay. And if the Dr. John Baumgartner spoke in a technical presentation recently, and he pointed out that if the organisms grow there, they're going to consume the carbon that's there, that's going to be C14 free. And so you need some way basically to get the carbon-14 from the surface down to where the material is that has the high levels of C14 where it shouldn't be. So let's say you basically got to have the fungus. It would have to somehow move and slide down several thousands of feet, see some coal, sit there, it's nothing but a story. It's nothing but imagination. Kentucky Atheist, he didn't engage anything. All he did was asserted contamination. He repeated arguments that have already been debunked, and he repeated them from people who repeated them from people who have already been dismantled directly by the by the rate team. So since I'm kind of losing my voice here, I think, yeah, so that's it for the C14. We're going to, in the next episode, we're going to get into more amazing lines of evidence for a young Earth, dinosaur, blood cells, blood vessels, proteins, and DNA where they shouldn't be, living fossils, Flume experiments, lunar recession, more on the magnetic field. So we're going to wrap this up here, guys. We got through a couple of the agnostic lines of evidence, but in the next episode, I am going to heavily focus on the next agnostic line of evidence, which is nested hierarchical patterns. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed episode 2 of my ongoing series here on Biblical Creationist, guys. It is a great time to be a biblical creationist. God bless all.